Hi there, it's John from Tutor to You. Welcome to the Economics Teachers Staffroom. In each episode we're going to consider a major topic facing economics teachers. We're going to ask our panel of experienced practitioners to give their advice and suggestions. Here we're going to discuss designing an effective Year 13 curriculum. Let's meet the panel.
Hi, I'm George Vlachonikolis. I'm a teacher of economics and have been for about 12 years now. I teach at Headington Rise School, which is an all-girls independent school in Oxford.
Hello, I'm Lisa Newton. I'm Head of Economics at an independent day school and boarding school in London. In addition, I'm a team leader on EdXL and I was leading a team on Paper 2 this year.
Hi, I'm Helen Gordon. I'm Head of Department at a large sixth form college in Wigan.
So my name's Ruth Tarrant and I'm the subject lead in economics at Tutor to You, where I've been working pretty much full time for nearly 10 years. Over the course of my teaching career, which has spanned about 20 years now, I've taught all of the major awarding bodies, been a senior examiner at a number of them, and taught in a whole different range of educational institutions, from comprehensive schools, sixth form colleges, universities, and independent schools.
How do you structure the Year 13 curriculum and when do you aim to finish the teaching?
Okay, so the Year 13 curriculum for me actually starts in Year 12. So we aim to finish the Year 12 curriculum around about Easter, or if not quite Easter, just after. And then we can actually make a start on the Year 13 material in the summer term of Year 12. And that has its advantages because it means I can finish on time. Because what I'm really aiming to do with Year 13 is I'm aiming to finish again by Easter, and if not, just before Easter. So in a perfect world, in an ideal situation, I'll finish either 2 or 3 weeks before the Easter holidays of Year 13, which then gives me a little bit of time with the students to do in-class revision before they then go away on Easter holidays and potentially only come back for 1 or 2 weeks before study leave at the other end. So if I can start them on good revision, then that's better for me, or better for them even. How do we structure the Year 13 curriculum? We try and knock off things like labour markets and sometimes even development economics at the back end of Year 12. And then we'll really start with the theory of the firm lessons from September, because I feel with theory of the firm, you've got to get in at September, take your time over all of the cost curves, all of the revenue curves, and then slowly build up all of the market structures information. And that's really got to be the main thrust of Year 13 teaching, certainly from a micro perspective. On a macro perspective, I think you can probably have more flexibility with what topic areas you put where. But for us, we start with fiscal policy, going into more depth with fiscal policy, because that's an area that they're relatively familiar with from Year 12. We're just adding new stuff onto it. We're going slightly more in depth with things like income tax, corporation tax, VAT. And then we go on to the kind of more specific Year 13 content beyond that, which for us is things like globalization, international trade, and even financial markets.
We teach Pearson Economics A. So by the end of the first year, the students will have done all of Theme 1, all of Theme 2. They'll have done labour markets in Theme 3, and they'll have touched on development in Theme 4. We've done it both ways. We've done micro first and macro first. We believe that macro first is better. So what we will do in the start of the second year, we will start by Theme 4 and we'll zip through Theme 4 pretty quickly. Then we'll start micro by October half term. We'll have started micro and we'll hope to finish Theme 3 in January. What we then do is do development right at the end. So we use development as a topic, as a catch-all of macro and micro, because development, you need to look at ideas of privatisation, etc., etc. So we pull all that in right at the end.
We pretty much follow the specification as the order makes sense. For the micro, building up from costs and revenues to monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, perfect competition, seems to make sense as the conceptual difficulty builds as you go through. In addition to which, I'm really keen to emphasize the sort of spiral curriculum aspect. So we're revisiting issues like elasticity, consumer and producer surplus when we're teaching theory of the firm. And, I think it's really important to keep revisiting last year's spec in order that it remains fresh in their mind. And there's lots of micro content in year 13 that really does chime back to year 12. For the macro, essentially the topics are globalization, protectionism, exchange rates, balance of payments, and then finally development and global institutions. I think teaching globalization and then teaching protectionism makes sense, but I think you can flip the order of teaching balance of payments and exchange rates. Again, I will have taught exchange rates in year 12 as an example of markets in demand and supply. I will also have taught it when I've discussed X minus M as a component of aggregate demand. So exchange rates, if you like, will have been covered twice in year 12, meaning when you get to teaching again in year 13, there should be a degree of familiarity, at least with how floating exchange rates work, because they will have been discussed in year 12. I would argue the big danger of the macro spec is you can spend enormous amounts of time on global current affairs and you can drift off the spec really easily. Pupils are keen on the current affairs aspect of it and what's going on geopolitically. So if you really do want them to get involved, it's probably better to use it as a flip learning exercise. The final topic that we teach is development. I like development being last because it's incredibly holistic. So in other words, it really connects up to lots of the work you've done in year 12. We aim to finish the spec by February half term. The mock exam takes place after February half term. Our mock exam is always a paper 3, which is very holistic. We may have bits and pieces that we haven't quite covered, but the aim is to finish the spec by February half term.
So where possible, I think I'd advise connecting as much of the year 13 curriculum in with year 12 as possible. So some things you can't really do very easily on that front. For micro, I think the market structures and cost and revenue work is quite standalone. So I would start with that in year 13 micro, but I would still be making sure that further back in year 12 that my students had a really strong grasp of concepts such as monopoly power or PED along a demand curve. I think a lot of the work on competition policy that appears in the year 13 spec can actually be linked in really nicely with year 12 work on policies to tackle market failure. Not only does it link in quite nicely with that, some students find it quite a dry topic, so I think spreading it out a little bit can really help. For year 13 macro, I would generally start with the big global topics, for example, trade, exchange rates, globalization, current account imbalances. But I'd be making sure that I link it all back to the circular flow and aggregate demand and aggregate supply so that we're building those skills with the year 12 content as well. I think a lot of the policy topics in year 13 macro can be supported with really effective year 12 macro teaching, where you don't just take a UK perspective. So thinking about different types of policy and the more global perspective in year 12, that supports a better, more efficient structure in year 13. I think the financial markets topic actually fits in pretty much almost anywhere. You could actually even do it at the end of year 12. It's quite a nice end of year 12 topic. It connects in really nicely with market failure and policies to correct it, as well as students starting to think about how changes in markets can have quite big systemic effects. I think the topic that needs the most careful planning is probably development economics. I actually personally wouldn't leave that until a giant block of work towards the end of the course, even though the spec makes it look like that's sort of where it fits. If you look at the specification, but particularly the EdXL specification, I think that's quite helpful for development economics, actually, regardless of which awarding body you teach. It's extremely detailed, lots and lots of bullet points for strategies for development, obstacles to development, and so on. But if you read all of those bullet points really, really carefully, I think about 60% of them appear elsewhere in the course across the whole A level. So I would be spending time in my department cross-referencing those with other parts of the syllabus, and then making sure that I'm touching on that at different points in the course. Many of the policies for development slot in really nicely into topics such as competition policy or supply side policy. So by really thinking carefully about where you can cover those topics earlier on in the course, so that all you have to do is just have a kind of knowledge retrieval activity or a very quick review in year 13, I think that means you can get through the year 13 specification pretty early in the spring term. And if you can do that, you can then plan to spend the rest of the time working on exam technique, helping students fill gaps. It can become a very personalised learning process at that point.
How do you combine content delivery and exam preparation?
We have a longer lesson each week. It's like an hour and 20 minutes. That is for exams. So they do 3 hours a week of specification and theory, and then an hour and 20 minutes from September to February is just for exams. So the students will be asked to complete a past paper. They might be asked to do some knowledge questions, and we'll test those, and we'll do some exam papers actually in that hour and 20-minute lesson. When we finish the course, then in January, we then start the 2-hour papers from February onwards, which means that students are asked to come during their lunch hour to complete a paper, which they all do. I've not had a student yet who's refused to do that. And then we will do exam papers from that point onwards. So basically, from September in the second year, students are prepping a paper every week. We go through that paper in lesson, and then they're doing some of it in timed conditions. And then from February time, they're doing a 2-hour paper each week with other papers around that.
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive as each other. So I certainly don't operate in a world in which I have content delivery lessons and then exam preparation lessons. I would say that exam preparation kind of underpins a hell of a lot of stuff I do in the classroom right from day one in year 12. So all of the certainly the homeworks, the assessments that we send home with the students, and quite a lot of in-class formative assessment as well, is all based on what the exam questions are going to look like. So it might just be multiple choice questions, but since we've got multiple choice questions coming up in the summer exam, that's a fairly useful thing to be testing. Short answer questions for me, because I'm teaching towards EdXL, can either be 2 markers or 4 markers. They can even be 5 markers, but then I'll make sure that I drop in fairly early on. 5 markers need to have 2 points of application in order to get the full marks. And then the evaluative questions that come off from the back of that, 8, 10, 12, 15, and even the essays, we'll be talking about that all the way through. And like I say, it will underpin every homework that my students do throughout 2 years. In terms of revision, I will try to finish the year 13 content just before Easter. which ensures that they have 2 weeks with me for revision, in-class revision with each other as well, before they go away on the Easter holidays and then again on study leave afterwards. During any mock exam periods, I normally try and keep 1 or 2 lessons aside for kind of in-class revision, which will help them with their mock exam preparation. And there's normally at least half a lesson after the mock exams for whole class feedback to make sure, again, we get the full value out of those mock exams.
We aim to finish the spec by February half term, and that then leaves us quite a bit of time to then focus on papers alone. This is for year 13. I would argue, though, that by the end of the first term in year 12, any assessment that we set will be using the assessment criteria that is the Edexcel exam board criteria. So in other words, any assignment that they do, be it an essay or a data response question, will use the mark bases that are used in the exam. So if you like, they're very used to the exam rubric very early on. There are lots and lots of past papers available. We don't necessarily just use Edexcel. We might use papers from across the exam boards, but we will adapt the mark schemes and the marks to suit the Edexcel spec.
I think the key word there, John, is combine. I would include exam questions with pretty much every topic and actually in every single lesson. That doesn't mean they have to be really long questions at all. You know, starting your lesson with a really good data chart with some kind of multiple choice question or calculation or definition can be really, really great here. It's actually quite easy to create your own 5-mark Edexcel questions or 2 or 4-mark AQA questions or a multiple choice question. So I'd be making sure that every single lesson contains something quantitative, some kind of relevant example, some diagram practice, and some chains of reasoning practice. In my view, there's no point spending absolutely ages on content delivery if students aren't handling and playing with that material in an exam style way for at least 50% of the time.
How do you know which areas to spend more time on and which to spend less time on?
This is a tricky one because to some extent it rather depends on your cohort. If you have a cohort that find the technical aspects such as elasticity and cost curves difficult, that is going to be more time consuming. What I would say though is you can save time in year 13 if you've done the things that I've suggested in terms of thinking about the curriculum in a very spiral fashion. Quite a lot of ADAS analysis that will crop up again in year 13 will have been covered in year 12. So if that's been well taught and well understood, you really don't need to be going through the mechanics of that. Your pupils should already have grasped it. In the same way that if you covered some of those development issues early on when talking about measurements of economic growth, again, you can sort of whiz through that relatively quickly. I think the challenge is, as I say, it's about the nature of your cohort. And I think it's also ensuring that you don't end up drifting off, particularly for things like globalization. It's really important that the basics are well taught because you are going to be reusing elasticity and ADAS constantly.
Gosh, this is a tricky question. I think this is the $1 million question actually here. I think constant assessment in class is really, really helpful and informative here. Now, by assessment, what I mean is really informal, low stakes assessment through quizzes and games, low stakes being the key here. By doing that, you get a really good sense of which areas students are more comfortable with and which ones they're less comfortable with. So that might change every single year that you deliver the course. So have some flexibility built into your schemes of learning. Ultimately, though, absolutely everything on the specification can be tested in an exam. So absolutely everything is important. Everything needs to be covered. So I'd be making sure that I spent time with students, ensuring that they know every single line in the spec.
Yeah, I guess 12 years of teaching has given me quite a lot of perspective on what students are likely to find hard and what they're likely to need to spend more time on. So certainly when it comes to year 13 content on theory of the firm, I just know that I'm going to have to spend an awfully long time on cost curves, not to pay lip service to them and just show them once on a whiteboard and say, right, learn that, but actually really go into the detail and into the maths behind it. This is why a marginal cost curve looks the way it does. This is how it relates to all of the other short run cost curves that you've got. I know that that's an area that they find challenging, and I've already built it into my scheme of work that we're going to spend a lot of time on that. Equally, I think just doing lots of kind of in-class checks for understanding, lots of formative assessment will give you a very, very good picture of how they're getting on. And if it's a bit of content in which they're clearly struggling, then I guess as a teacher, you've got to make a judgment call. Is this a kind of pivotal, foundational hinge type of bit of content where they've just got to know it and therefore we can't just carry on and pass go and carry on as normal? Or is this a relatively kind of abstract idea that won't come into much of the other course? And sometimes you're prepared to leave it and come back to it at another time as a teacher then. I think that, again, just comes with experience. There is another answer to this question, though. Which area to spend more time on? Ask them. I think the students are often the best judge of what they know and what they don't know, or at least, let me put it a different way, what they feel confident about and what they don't feel confident about. And for those of teachers that are teaching macro, it's my observation that students almost always feel less confident with the macro rather than the micro. So don't feel personally slighted by that. If we have a slightly unbalanced weighting in your teaching, like we do at my school, I would always put that on the macro, because I think that's probably where the students need a little bit more time just to make sure that they're happy with where the chains of analysis begin, where the chains of analysis end, and what diagrams they're meant to be drawing in order to support those chains of analysis.
Well, this can come from your own experience of the year group. As I've said, we tend to overteach on certain parts of theme 2, so we really make sure students understand ideas like elasticity, the circular flow, trade, which means then that when we get into year 13, we can spend maybe slightly less time in certain areas because the understanding is really there with the students. So theme 4, we tend to have completed within a month. We do a bit of development at the end of year 12, and then we pick up that development really at the end of the year 13. But the rest of theme 4, it takes about a month for us to do. In relation to theme 3, probably slightly longer, maybe 6 weeks. But I do like to spend quite a bit of time on theory of the firm. My experience is that if students don't understand how those key curves come about, if they don't understand about what a marginal cost curve is, what average cost curves are, why we have average cost curves, as well as why we have marginal cost curves, I feel that then it's very difficult for them to analyse a market situation. And then at the end, we spend a little bit more time on maybe understanding recent news stories. So looking at key industries, for example, water or rail industry, and looking at what the regulator's done and looking at what the key issues are for society as a whole, if those key sectors are not improved in relation to their efficiency.
What are the biggest challenges in designing an effective Year 13 curriculum?
Again, another really good question, John. I think there are 2 big challenges here. Firstly, probably the really practical elements, such as gaps just appearing in your scheme of learning because you've got open days at your school, You've got students on uni visits or away for interviews, plus the inevitable things such as staff absence and so on. I think proofing your scheme of learning against that can be tricky, but I visited some really great schools and colleges in the last few years, and they've been making increased use of flipped learning where appropriate to do so. So students learning topics at home by themselves using the range of videos and resources that are available out there, and then using the class time for question practice. And that can help mitigate some of those issues with, students being missing or staff absence, because actually getting someone to cover supervised timed work is more straightforward than finding someone to cover the delivery of a particular topic. So the first big challenge are all those really practical things that really build up over the course of a year. I think the second big challenge is the increasingly wide range of student ability that I think we often have in the economics classroom. Certainly when I first started teaching, which is about 20 years ago, economics was typically the preserve of the more academic students. And so in the past, some of the students we might now have on our courses would just simply not have been in our classroom. But numbers are rising, so well over 40,000 entries now every year for economics A-level. So I think a really big challenge here is making sure that students, regardless of their ability and their level, are making progress and, importantly, staying engaged. So to tackle that, I think there's a lot to be said for really finding out what makes those students tick, trying to find examples, work with them to connect in their own real life experience to the topics, supporting them with personalised learning plans.
Well, there's a number of challenges really, both, internally from the specification, it's difficult. Some parts of it are very challenging, particularly for teachers who aren't as confident or for students that aren't as confident. There can be problems if you've had a non-economic specialist teaching a first year class coming through to second year, and you might need to revisit some key ideas.
I think one of the biggest difficulties in year 13 is there is a vertiginous step up for the micro content. It becomes infinitely more difficult. Therefore, bringing less confident pupils with you, particularly those who are a bit nervous about the graphs and the maths underpinning a lot of those graphs, is quite a challenge. The step up really is significant, and for some pupils, they find it quite a challenge. What we tend to do in order to address that is, for those pupils who find it a bit tricky, we will run a sort of a lunchtime class, a 30-minute, what I like to call a HIT class. And quite often, those HIT classes will be focused on something like the kink demand curve or game theory, something really specific that is designed to help pupils, to give them a real sort of whistle-stop tour through the topic, and just to give them the bare bones of what they need to be able to manipulate in an exam. You might have further mathematicians who find all of that easy, and then you might have pupils who aren't doing maths at all and might be, slightly freaking out at those graphs. So I think a challenge in year 13 for micro is accepting that it's a broad church. Your pupil body is a broad church, and really the issues arise with that particular topic. I think a further challenge is in the first term, lots of them are very, very sidetracked by university applications, which means they might not always have their head in the game for focusing on the A-level specification. And so ensuring they remain on track and covering the content and doing the preps is important. But I think that first term is very, very busy and very, very pressured. So keeping on track and making sure you cover the spec is really important. To make sure they're match fit for the A-levels, I think it's very important to keep question practice going on, as well as delivering the spec. So I think year 13 challenge is clearly finishing the spec, ready for the mock, whenever that might be, or ensuring that they are well enough prepared for the mock that you can give them a proper exam paper. Maybe you've got to doctor it a bit if you haven't fully finished the spec. But I think they're the big challenges. The pressures that the pupils face in year 13, finishing the spec, but also ensuring that you are always delivering that exam practice throughout the year.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Economics Teachers Staff Room.